Steve Metelsky, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for having me on.
All right, first order of business is thanking Steve Murphy over at the Game of Crimes podcast for the intro. Otherwise, this wouldn't have happened. So thank you, Steve Murphy.
Yeah, Murph's a great guy, and it's great to make some awesome connections with some good people in the United States.
Yeah, I had him and his partner Javier on the show about a year and a half ago. They're somewhere in that ballpark. And I tell you what, no BS. They are some of the most down-to-earth, nice guys you'll ever meet.
Yeah, I haven't had not the fortunate opportunity to meet Javier yet, but know a lot about him sort of vicariously through Murph, and then having read their book and other books and their different documentaries. But I can say Steve Murphy, he would give you the shirt off his back to anybody. He's just a genuinely caring, down to earth, nice guy.
Yeah, he truly is. And his partner Hav, same thing. They were a joy to talk to. And, now I've kind of gotten to know Steve and I consider him a friend. And it's just, yeah, just a super, super nice guy. So thank you, Steve, from Game of Crimes. And yeah, otherwise this wouldn't have happened. So let's go back into the beginning here, Steve. What spurred your interest in law enforcement? Was there any family or friends in law enforcement?
Yeah, I grew up. My father, in the '60s and into the '70s, was with. They called it the Metropolitan Toronto Police Force back then. It's the Toronto Police Service now, but he was a member back then. And as a young kid, I don't even know if they still do these, but it was really probably at its height in the 1970s. They had Toronto would host the international police games, and they would have these, feats of strength and tug of war against other, highly trained athletes with different police agencies across Canada and the United States. And if I'm not mistaken, some international teams. And I remember being, having a front row seat literally as a youngster back then, watching, these gargantuan officers, but really athletes. I was just sort of taken aback and enamored by sort of that whole idea of what they did for a living, and then sort of wrapped around in the police game. So that was kind of the catalyst as a young kid. Like, it really kind of inspired me also to really start working out. I played hockey growing up in Canada, but that
Sure.
was really kind of the starting point, was that connection with my dad, bringing me to those games in the '70s.
Also, that was the international police games or whatever.
Don't quote me on the international part because it's
Oh,
been a
okay.
long time,
But there was
but they
teams from
definitely.
America and Canada.
I just remember there were many, many teams, and I'm pretty sure there were teams from different police agencies in the United States. Yes.
Oh, cool. Was there any, let's see, cigar smoking, donut eating competitions? Because I I could probably do okay with those, but that's about it.
Well, I have like vivid memories, like it was yesterday. They were, elite athletes,
Okay.
in top shape.
Yeah.
And that's always something I've always wanted to aspire to be, is an athlete as well. So, you still try to take care of yourself, but really that was a really major turning point. And I will say that even given that, policing was in a short list of a few things I wanted to do. It wasn't at the very top of the list. So when I was doing my undergrad degree at the University of Toronto, policing was probably third or fourth. I really had aspirations of applying to law school, of
Okay.
going into business. I did my undergrad and my graduate degree in criminology. So I really also even thought of maybe going into, something criminal psychology related as well. So it was really just, Patrick, just, being in the right place and right time. And when I graduated in the '90s, Halton Regional Police, which is a jurisdiction just outside of our big city, Toronto, they did a posting, and it was actually my dad that told me about it. He said they're doing, and I don't know if they do this anymore, but they call it like a quick hire, where they were going to do
Mm.
all the testing over the span of one weekend. Like, you started out at that time, it's completely changed and been revamped now, but the main physical component, where push-ups, pull-ups, mile and a half run, you had to do it in a
Yep.
certain amount of time. But to get to the physical component, you first had to pass, the analytical, they called it the GAT-B. Like it was a lot of mathematics,
Oh gosh.
questions, deduction, reasoning,
Okay.
inductive reasoning. And long story short, I just, I was keeping in shape. And at that time, when I had graduated, I actually got hired to teach at a local college. It wasn't full time, but that was keeping me employed and busy, waiting to decide. Like I literally was going to apply to law school the following semester, but that happened to just come up. So it's really about the timing and proximity to things and opportunities when they arise. And I took advantage of it. And as they say, the rest is history.
Well, your dad was a police officer for what, 20 years?
Just under 20 years. And then
Okay.
he shifted to work for the government of Ontario, the Ministry of the Solicitor General. And he was a leader in the rollout of what in the United States is referred to as NCIC, your
Oh, okay.
national
Yeah, yeah.
computer database. He played a pivotal role in the rollout. Our version in Canada is called CPIC, and it's an acronym for Canadian Police Information Computer.
Hmm.
So that was back like in the early 80s, I would say.
Okay. Now, what year did you get hired on to the police department?
I did the quick hire in 95. And then the
Oh,
irony is the training officer got transferred out and a new one came in. So the interviews went into 96. So I got hired in 96.
oh, okay.
And I think it's important for your listeners, like at that time, and I've heard it on different podcasts, especially in the United States, there's really not a lot of difference. We have different laws and obviously jurisdictions and
Right.
titles, but the demand for people applying to police agencies in the early to mid 90s was massive.
Yeah,
And I'm a centered guy. I'm not an egotistical driven at all. But it was really ultra competitive then, especially compared to now. The demand, there's still the supply. They need police officers, but the demand isn't quite like it was, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. So I felt very fortunate. I'd worked my tail off to be ready for anything.
sure.
Always kept in shape, always keeping the CV up to date, and educating myself and volunteering. So the timing just happened to be right. And when policing was sort of a number three goal at that moment, it was elevated to I got to take advantage of what's available to me now, and I did it, and as I said, it all worked out. So I was very thankful.
We're very similar in trajectory because I entered the academy, I got hired on in 1995, January 16 of 95, and I retired January 16 of 2020. So I did 25. That was with our pension system, you had to do 25 to get a full pension. So
Oh, okay.
I was like,
That's that that's a good amount of time.
yeah, it's more than enough. It's
Yeah,
probably too much, but but still, looking back, it was the greatest job I ever had. I retired as a sergeant, and yeah, I mean, we've talked about this before. I don't think there's a better job on any police department as being the sarge.
absolutely. I totally, and I retired as a surgeon as well, so we have a lot in common on a lot of different layers. And I agree with you, Patrick. It was great being a supervisor where you still had, the literal and sometimes figurative operational boots on the ground where you could run a team or
Yep.
you're still involved and immersed in the action. I'm an A-type personality. So, in Canada, the next promotion bump after sergeant is there's different wordings. If you're in uniform, it would be staff sergeant, but if you're promoted to the same rank and you're in an investigative position, it's detective sergeant. They're
Mm.
the same ranks, they just have different
They're different jobs.
connotations depending
Yeah.
on where you're working.
Yeah, they're different jobs.
And
One investigations, the other one's probably patrol.
that's it. And
Yeah.
I really found, and I had done enough acting time, like when I was a sergeant, if the boss was off, you would
Yeah,
get acting time to fill that
absolutely.
position.
Yep.
And I got a really good, lots of experience at that level to at least formulate the opinion in terms of my future goals that this job at the next level wasn't for me, because you're kind of chained to a desk.
Yep,
You're
absolutely.
more of a manager. You really do remove yourself. That one promotional bump removes you effectively from the action on the
Yes.
street, and it just wasn't for me. So I was quite content, even when some of my colleagues were, getting promoted up and asking me why. I was always honest. I said, well, I'm really content at this level, man. I don't want to, keep the chain, and I don't want to be chained to a desk.
Yeah, I totally, totally see that because I was the same way, as punishment, you'd be the acting lieutenant because for where I was,
Right.
you start out in patrol as a police officer, then if you want to promote, you go to sergeant, then the next step up is lieutenant. And again, unless you're assigned to some secret squirrel, really cool like unit where you can go out and play reindeer games as a lieutenant, you're chained to the desk.
Yeah.
That's your job. And I remember, I think it was my first or second night as a brand new sergeant. They're like, "You're lieutenant tonight," and I'm like, "Huh? Yeah, you're gonna run the shift." Because nobody else wanted to. It's not because I was good at it or anything
Yeah.
special. It's because through default of all my buddies that were sergeants, they're like, "Hey, there's a new guy. Let's mess with him." It's like
Yeah.
you're now the lieutenant because the lieutenant's on vacation. I'm like, sure, why not? What could go wrong, right? So I
That's
remember
right.
I had a homicide that night. They're calling it in. I'm just like, what do I do with this again? Yeah, I'll figure it out. What the hell? Not a big deal. But
Yeah.
like everything in police work, you figure it out. It's like one way or another. But I really enjoyed the sergeant thing because you could take care of your guys. And by guys, your cops. And not in a nefarious way where, you're like taking care of them or hiding stuff. It's like, no, you were the buffer between management and them. Between the lieutenant and the captain and them. You're the one that's like, it was like being a dad. And it's like, okay, do we have to have a talk? Do we have to have a come to Jesus meeting here? It's like at least a sergeant could do that. I mean, obviously there
Right.
was instances where I had to arrest cops. I mean, nobody likes doing that. But when your hand is forced, it's on rails and it's not going, it can't go off the rails. So
Yeah.
but if I could help my guys out, and I'm sure you had the same thing where it's like, they'd come in and something was wrong, and before you know, it's like, yeah, I had to put my dog down today. It's like, go home. Your head isn't in this game right now.
Mm.
So, and they always, always appreciate that that you did take care of them. And, it wasn't about you, it was about them and making sure they're safe and they go home in one piece and they do their jobs right all day long. So yeah, we had the best job ever. But I'm
Yeah. Totally agree.
thinking back to your dad. I'm sure that was influential because did he leave for work or come home in uniform or talk about the job at all when you were young?
I don't have a lot of memories of him in that regard,
Okay.
because he always was mostly in a suit.
Mhm.
Um, but there were stories. Yeah, not as much. I remember, and I actually talk about it in the intro of my book. Those early 1970s, my first real exposure to what the word undercover meant was through my dad, and just really quickly, it was a hot summer day in. I grew up just outside of Toronto. I was born in Toronto, but grew up in a suburb called Mississauga, outside of Toronto, and it was about 85, 90 degrees, and I was with my dad out front, and this bucket of bolts on four tires rolls up, and it was like right out of, I'm dating myself here, but like Starsky and Hutch. But they didn't look like the good guys. These two behemoth thugs get out of the car, and my dad's at the bottom of the driveway. I'm in the garage, and I remember thinking, as a kid, I had that spidey sense, that intuition, like either these guys are lost or something bad is about to happen. Because these
Yeah.
guys, why are they wearing long leather coats? It's 90 degrees. They had the button or lamp, whatever you call it, long beards,
Yeah.
and my dad calls me down, and I remember it was the longest walk in my life. because I'm walking in slow motion, I could see my dad shaking hands with them, and I'm like, why is my dad friends with these guys? Like these guys look like hitmen, and they could tell, I think, from my reaction, and just it was visceral and extreme in my body language, and they said, it's okay, son, we're friends with your dad. And I'm still remember, like, it was yesterday, the one guy opening his coat, and he had a shoulder holster with a handgun, and he
Yeah.
said, we're working undercover. They had come by to just,
Mm,
I guess they were on their way to do a job, and they just came by to say hi to my dad really quick because they were going to Toronto or something like that. And
gotcha.
in that moment, those memories kind of become imprinted on,
I
in
would think
your
so. Yeah, for a
in
young
your
kid, hell
brain.
yeah.
And it was, in like the span of 10 seconds, something traumatic to like something cool transpired, and that's always stayed with me. And really is kind of, in another weird kind of way, that whole A-type excitement of getting into that type of work was appealing later on.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be a big influence for sure. Now, specifically, why did you go to the Halton Regional Police in Ontario? I mean, I know your dad kind of pushed you, he informed you that they were hiring. And, like what you said before, the competition was fierce back then. I was a
Mhm.
95 guy. I got hired in 95. I was on the waiting list for 4 years. When I took the written test,
Wow.
there was what, 3,500 people that just took the written test,
Yeah,
probably for like
that's
400
incredible.
jobs. Yeah, and now they could barely scrape up enough for like one academy. We're pushing 4 academies out a year, which was unheard of.
Mhm.
Yeah, and there were different times, obviously. But did you think about maybe going to other agencies or maybe the Mounties, the RCMP?
I had done my due diligence and researched. In Canada, we have, like, Halton was municipal,
Hmm.
so it's a fairly decent sized service, but not as big as like a Toronto Police, which is a city service. And then in Canada, Ontario, we have the provincial police. Ontario, OPP is the acronym, Ontario Provincial Police. And I thought about the OPP, and I also thought about federal, which is the RCMP. But at that stage, you're still a young person, and I had seen some parts of the world, but I really wasn't super interested in relocating across the country at
Mm,
that point.
sure.
And you do risk that inherent danger applying to the OPP, but even more so with the RCMP.
Yeah, they could put you anywhere.
Typically,
Yeah.
they can put you anywhere. And typically, the RCMP, they will move you completely out of the province you live in to start. So that could be, north Canada, where it's 10 months of winter and 2 months of really bad snowmobiling. That's
Ugh.
my favorite northern Canadian joke, by the way, for your listeners. We have very seasonable weather. I'm in Niagara, just on the other side of Buffalo, New York, and we were talking before the show. It's, December, what, 10th or 11th today, and we're about 35, 40 degrees today. So we do have winter, but nothing like northern Canada. So um, for those reasons, I kind of was hesitant to
Mm.
do that. I was much happier working closer to home, closer to a big city, and that's it. It just happened to work out that way.
I know RCMP. I've interviewed my favorite Mountie, Forrest Machek. She's great. I love talking to her. And she told me about her experience. And there's one like regional training center, and it could be hundreds and hundreds of miles for some people. And you stayed there. It was a barracks. It was like a military type situation. Now, what was your police academy experience for like how big was the department that you were joining?
It's over 1,000 now. I think back in the mid '90s, it was probably 700,
Okay.
and we were a small class. There was six of us that were hired. There were thousands that applied. The demand was crazy at that time,
Right.
and we had any police agency in Ontario, like the RCMP, has their own training facility, and it's in the west. It's in Saskatchewan,
Hmm.
and for anybody that's municipal or even provincial, they're going to go to the Ontario Police College, and it's about 2 hours outside of Toronto, just near another city called London, Ontario. It's in a small town called Elmer. It's an old military base, and in the mid '90s, it was run. The police college was run almost like a pseudo paramilitary
Hmm.
facility. We had to be up early in our number one dress, boots shined, the 10 kilometer, 8 mile run. Your bed had to be made, all the corners had to be like, it was very ritualistic in terms of adhering to the military standards. That's all kind of gone by the wayside now, unfortunately. But it really, I really do credit that, growing up with a European father, very instilling hard work and discipline. The police college at that time really was about that. And I was already kind of used to that sort of standard, but it really was, I found it just extremely beneficial as a life tool for me. Just being on top of things. My dad always would say, if you're going to do something, do it right 110% the first time. And that's what the police college was all about, was training to be successful, and everything outside of that, adhering to that discipline and that code. So that was something I really enjoyed. It wasn't the best facility. um the rooms were like, you had your own little room, and they called them pods, and there was, you'd have 10 of your classmates, and there'd be a big pod with 10 mini ones. And you, at times, you felt like you were, doing time.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because our county jail is pods. So that's the
Yeah.
first thing when you start talking about pods and a bunch of people living together, I think of jail. So, it's probably very similar. But I think
Yeah.
there's something to be said about the older ways, and maybe I'm sounding like a crusty old cop, but I still have friends that are on the job. And our police academy, when I got in there, it was paramilitary as well. Lots of inspections and marching and, learning how, about face, left face, right face, running until you puke, blah, blah, blah. And,
Yeah.
and they injected stress. It wasn't unrealistic to have somebody screaming in your ear if you were falling behind on a run,
Oh,
or
yeah.
or whatever the case may be. It's like if you messed up, they're gonna let you know about it. But we had just fantastic instructors. Their hearts were in the right places, and you
Mhm.
could tell that they 100% wanted you to succeed. They were there to help you succeed. And again, sometimes, yeah, they're gonna, put the fear of Jesus into you. They're gonna inject stress. They're gonna do whatever. But I was a little bit older. I was 30, so I wasn't a 21-year-old kid who was like, oh shoot, he's really gonna fire me tomorrow. No, he's not. So I had a little bit of that going on, but I'll give you an example. Maybe about 6 months ago at our training academy, now they're trying to make it an adult learning center. And I'm like, okay. And two female recruits went to the I think no, the deputy inspector of the training academy, which is
Yeah.
unheard of. You have a chain of command. Why they didn't do something right then and there? It's like, unless somebody's threatening your life, there's like a sexual harassment thing or somewhere where you can't go to the next level, that's where you should be going. You should be talking to your sergeant, not me. I would have shown them the door. But they're like, we have, there's two instructors that are yelling at us, and we don't like that. So this deputy inspector is like, oh, really? So she brings in these two instructors, and they're like, yeah, hell yeah. Yes, we yell at recruits. They need to be yelled at. We need to inject stress and see how they're going to react. And you know what? Sometimes they may not react very favorably at first, but we'll teach them some coping skills. And this is training. This is the place to learn these things, not when they're
Yeah.
out on the street. When
100%.
when real stress comes into play, and people will be screaming at you. People are gonna, yeah, it's not a classroom. And what her answer to that was get rid of the two instructors. And I'm like, I heard that and I
Wow.
was so saddened. I'm like, really? You are doing
Yeah.
those recruits such a disservice by doing that.
Yeah.
It's like I said before, you have to inject that stress. You have to have that, oh shit, I have to pass this run. There is no falling out. And it does two things. A, you get into great shape, and B, there's no quit. And if you're getting shot at or you're wounded and you have to keep moving, you have to have that mindset. You have to have it.
And it's just it's tough love. Like,
Yep.
it's and that's I don't want to get too caught up in today, but it's like, wow, the trajectory of, where we're at with certain occupations and just the overall political climate in terms of oversensitivity. Like certain jobs you have to be, and especially policing, when you're immersed in the front line. I mean, that's where you have to cut your teeth on making mistakes, is in training.
Yes, absolutely.
Because, and it was a great facility. They would bring in actors, and we had realistic, bedrooms and the floor
Yeah.
model of homes, and whether it be a domestic situation or a regular, you know, I don't like using the word regular, but they would purport it to be this, non-emergency call, but then the
Mhm.
person would pull out a knife. Like, you never knew. And you talk about stress at the Ontario Police College, they would have, above where the scenario rooms are, they would have a railing. So sometimes you were a lone officer, or you'd be in a scenario partnered up with someone from your class, but the remainder of your class and the instructors were up top looking down on you.
Yeah.
So you literally could feel like everybody's eyes burning
Yeah.
into your back.
And you don't want to mess up in
And
front of all your buddies, you know. It's like you don't want to look like a
yeah,
goof. You don't want to
but
be that guy.
some people, really do crumble and buckle to the pressure. I always embrace that as a challenge.
Sure.
And I'm not perfect. No one's perfect. Yeah, everyone made mistakes, but it actually got me pumped up. And not to get sidetracked, but I did comedy for 20 years and a little bit of improv. So, I always kind of liked having an audience, even if it was stressful.
Well,
So
if
I
you,
was
I
like,
didn't
hey,
know that
sink or
about you. That's really cool because I'll tell you what,
I'm
maybe
completely
our list.
unfunny now, though, Patrick. So just, I have to put that out there.
Well, I give kudos to any comedian that's got the balls to go up in front of an audience and try to make them laugh. I can't think of, there's the fear of public speaking or whatever. Doing that would be like fear of public speaking times 10 or 100
Yeah.
or whatever. I mean, I give you nothing but kudos, but if you can try to entertain people and make them laugh, etc., you must have been great on the street. It's
It
like
really,
that's
yeah.
such a valuable tool because the gift of gab is like 90% of what you're doing on that job.
Yeah. And it helped me even more, when I applied for the undercover pool and the training to become an operator. You, you have to bring something unique and different to the table that separates you from other applicants. And, you know, I've said this before, and I'm not an ego guy at all, but a lot of cops don't even want to do that work. And then a lot of cops aren't cut out to do that type of
Right.
work. And I really
Absolutely.
found that that sort of training in my previous life. I did stand up actually while I was a cop, but I did it under a different name for a few years too. And and I wrote a crime column under a pseudonym while I was an officer too. So I love doing different multitasking things throughout my career. But that I really equate, when you're waiting in the back of a comedy club and they're about to call your name, if you don't have that butterfly feeling before going on stage or going into an undercover op, or even in a simulated scenario at a police college, then something's wrong,
Yeah,
because it's a
absolutely.
natural human phenomena. But what people don't understand, and I actually teach my students this, is that there's good stress, and that feeling you have is actually, good stress. It's building you up for the challenge, and to be resilient. And if you identify it differently, you're going to react and treat it like negative stress, and you're going to perform poorly. But I found, just that experience, though, not only confidence, but thinking quick on your feet was a major
Oh, sure.
bonus with just talking to people in general too.
Yeah, there's all, there's always catchphrases, being a cop for 25 years and being, doing this for, a few more years. there's always like the hot new thing or whatever, and de-escalation, is like a big, they teach classes on it. There's verbal
Mhm.
judo, there's all different ways of de-escalating, and it's been around forever because after you got in your first fight on the job, you're like, okay, that wasn't fun. It's not like TV. Somehow, some way, this whatever hurts, and it's not a good thing. And you're like, okay, it'd be a lot better if I could just talk my way through this.
Yeah.
Some instances you can't. There's you go from 0 to 100 in half a second, and there's no getting around it. But there are instances where, we've all worked with those cops that could make Mother Teresa a fighter. They could make Gandhi a no person. It's like, really? They're the polar opposite. Then I've
Yeah.
worked with other people that should have been stand-up comics. That's what, like sparked it in my head. I have all these pictures in my head, just like little film clips of these cops that had these, like total dirtbags, mopes, laughing their butts off that, 2 minutes before that wanted to fight. And
Yeah.
instead they're just howling, laughing. I'm just like, man, that's a gift. It's like you guys are good.
When I used to, as a detective, I used to teach experience and brand new cops, organized crime, informant development, and even I think we even did a little bit of undercover stuff as well. But the first in a lot of classrooms, especially with new recruits, I would open with, "What's the greatest weapon at your disposal?" And most, not all, but most times, they would talk about their use of force options, and I would say, "No,
No,
everybody's wrong. It's your ability to communicate in any given situation." And I still use that at the beginning of whether it's a criminology or intro to law class, criminal psych that I'm teaching now. I open with that because regardless of, I'm not being a hypocrite. We all have the devices,
sure.
and it's really this decline in interpersonal communication because of the onslaught of technology. And, nothing will ever replace anybody's ability to communicate clearly. And that's a key competency in any line of work, your ability to communicate with people.
Well,
And at the student level, it's about, you know, what's the first thing you're going to do when you're looking to go out into the work world is you have to have a really good CV. You have to have experience, even volunteer experience, and you have to sell yourself in an interview, and you have to do
absolutely.
that with your spoken communication skills. So there's no acronyms, there's no texting, there's no phoning it in. You got to be sitting there in the hot
Yeah.
seat and you have to be prepared. So regardless of where we are on the tech grid with AI and all this stuff coming in, Patrick, nothing will ever fully replace, our capacity or need to be effective communicators. If we I think a lot of people we need to be doing that uh, away from the devices more than we're doing now.
I totally agree. Nothing is going to replace you at 3 o'clock in the morning being the cop, talking to this very angry drunk that's bigger, stronger, younger, faster than you, and that person knows they're going to jail. And you're the guy that's going to, put on the bracelets. But there's one of two ways this is going to play out. One, it's going to be a big old brawl, and you're going to be calling for everybody and their grandma to help you out. Or they want to put on their own handcuffs and are happy to go into their squad car with you. And it's all how you talk to them.
Yeah,
You know,
100%.
it is a skill. And like I said before, there are a small percentage of cases where I don't care who you are. Yeah, the fur is going to be flying. There's no way around it. It's just the way it is. But more times than not, man, you could talk your way through just a multitude of stuff. And it is a lost art, I think. It's like I've got kids. And, not too long ago, one graduated from college, and him and his buddies were using like dating apps. They all are in college. And I'm like, where's your game? Can't you go up to a girl at a party or a bar and just sell yourself? Just start with a little conversation or whatever. And they're like, yeah, we don't do that. And I'm like, what? It's like, yeah, now it's swipe to the left, swipe to the right, or whatever. I'm like, you're young dudes. That should be like older, desperate people like me. I mean, come on now. Yeah. It shouldn't be, you're in the prime of your life right now. You shouldn't be doing it, via, a cell phone for God's sakes. This is ridiculous. I'm like,
And
you got,
especially with all the spams and
oh,
scams and,
you got that right.
frauds, like you don't know who you're talking to on the other end of that phone most times. So
No,
yeah,
hell no. But
you
let's take
know,
a look at
and
your career trajectory. You
for sure.
specialized in organized crime, undercover operations, and informant development. How did that happen?
Well, I have to say, I've always been an avid reader. And even as a young kid, my favorite books to read were true crime.
Hmm,
And there was an awesome, and now being a crime writer myself, I find it like I living vicariously through some of my favorite crime writers that I would read. Max Haynes used to do this really popular column for the Toronto Sun, one of the big papers in Toronto. And, I just always wanted to read and learn more. And I really became interested in organized crime at a really young age. Like, just, I couldn't read enough about it. And when that parlayed into a police career, my ultimate goal, even from day one, I spent very little time in uniform. In Canada, you have to do your obligatory first 4 years in uniform to go
sure.
through fourth class, third, and you're on probation and you have to pass tests and physicals and all that. But my goal in those 4 years, my coach officer, when you graduate from the academy and come back, you ride with a coach for 3 months. And he said something to me from day one was, your reputation will initially be learned by the way you write reports and how many arrests and the quality of the work you do. They may not know who you are, but if they see your name on a lot of arrest reports
True.
and, written communication skills, and I knew early on in uniform, you've got to do a variety of things. I was never a big traffic guy. To be honest, I hated it, but I, I didn't shun it. And, even informant development, I found a way to check as many boxes when I would do a task, especially if it was proactive. So, for example, you're working a Saturday day shift. And at that time, if you work in a Saturday or Sunday day shift, back in the mid 90s where I worked, you could typically bank on there being pockets of quiet moments. And,
Hmm.
you'd set up radar or something because you did have to write tickets. But that's where your discretion as an officer comes into play. And you are the front line and you can use your communication skills. My philosophy was always respect is a two-way street. I would use that when I eventually became an informant developer, and I would use that with bad guys, bad people. I'm not here to judge you. Respect is a two-way street. But when I was a brand new officer and you pull someone over, it's your ability to build a bridge with that person. It's not like it is now with a lot of people and the hatred and disdain for police, which is awful to see. But I always call it the planting the seed. You could give them a ticket for the full amount, which I rarely ever did. You could give them a warning, or you had the discretion to knock a ticket down, especially if it was something like speeding. And I really use that as an opportunity. You have that person as your audience to be professional, to leave a good impression. And I'm not standing on a soapbox, but sometimes I would write people for a reduced ticket, but it's the way you talk to people. And before I would leave, they would actually thank me and shake my hand. It wasn't for the ticket. I think it was obviously for the discretion, but
Right.
I invested the time to speak to them one on one, not down at them. I was never a power tripper. It used to drive me crazy when you'd see certain cops they would try to jam people with as many tickets. Like, I just wasn't a believer of that. Depending on the circumstances, if it's obviously deserved, then absolutely
Yep.
I would not shy away from doing that. But um that's really where I realized uh it was a good sort of training ground for talking to people and whatnot. And you know I have to tell you, can I tell you this story that
Sure.
resulted from a traffic stop? I use this. It's just the reality. Again, I don't want to come across like so many other men and women are good at doing the same thing. But I really was interested in that. And I call it planting the seed because sometimes your ability to leave an impression with someone could pay dividends much further on. And this was when I was in uniform, relatively new, and I stopped the person, and we had discretion. If they didn't have their insurance card, I think the fine at the time was like $500 or $600 or something like
Oh,
that. I
yikes.
easily could have written him a ticket for no insurance.
Yeah.
But, technically there's a 24-hour period, or I said they were adamant that they had it, and I never got upset or raised my voice. I talked to people like I would want to be uh, addressed as well. And I said, I'll tell you what, I'm back in tomorrow on nights. I'm going to give you my card. I'm going to write the fax number for the district now. If you have your insurance card, when you go home, make a photocopy of it, fax it. When I come in tomorrow night, if it's there, we're good to go. I will rip it up, and that's it. But I'm going to give you that opportunity because I believe you. And sure enough, I came in the next night and it was there, and it was said and done. Fast forward, and I'm not kidding. It was about a decade later. I'm a detective in a detective office just before I went into Intel, and our administrative assistant um, usually would call your desk to say there's a call, but she walked over and said, "I've got this guy on line two. He won't identify who he is, and he doesn't want to speak to anybody except you." And I said, "Okay, I'll go take it in a side room." And I didn't recognize the voice on the line, and they said, "I don't know if you remember me, but I'm going to be straight up. You pulled me over 10 years ago. Um, I don't like most cops. I have information about a homicide, and I need to tell somebody, and I trust you." And at that point, that literally was the catalyst of that person becoming a very carded, I would say, high echelon confidential human source for about 8 years. They actually were
Wow.
very well embedded in different genres, I'll just say. So I always used that when I was teaching informant development with brand new officers and rookies. Is you're the front line.
Yeah.
You're going to be, if there's a murder, they're not dispatching the homicide detectives. If there's
Right.
a mob guy that just pulled up to this plaza, unless they're under surveillance or there's surreptitious poll cameras, you're going to be that first one there, and you're going to be the one that pulls that person over. So take that opportunity to, again, use your communication skills, use your discretion skills within the confines of what is ethical and moral and lawful, and take that opportunity to build a bridge with that person, because you never know where something could lead to. And I just coin that the planting the seed with somebody.
Yeah, what jumps out at me is, absolutely, I love that story. Obviously for like new cops, safety first. That should be the first thing in your brain when you're approaching that car. And it's
100%.
funny because where I worked, nobody had insurance, nobody had a driver's license. It was a different breed altogether. If we're stopping cars, we're looking for dope, we're looking for guns, or the guy's wanted for something or whatever. You never know what it's like Forrest Gump. It's like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get out of that stuff.
Yeah.
It was fun. Lots of stolen cars, lots of shenanigans that way. But I remember I was on like a violent crime task force for a summer where we went into the worst neighborhoods in the city every day. And it was just, scorch the earth kind of mentality. But the captain who was in charge of it and the lieutenant on the first day said, I want you guys to be aggressive. I want you, obviously within the boundaries of the law, et cetera. But when you're arresting somebody and you're going to be arresting a lot of people, which we did, you know, take the 5 seconds, take the 20 seconds, take the 2 minutes to explain to them why they're going to jail. A lot of times that just calms people down. I understand where you're trying to get handcuffs on somebody, and that's a very, very dangerous time when you're doing that. That's when a lot of bad stuff happens, is when it's like, bing, the light goes off in the bad guy's head, and the bracelets come out, and it's like, oh shit. That's where a lot of the fights, happen, a lot of the bad stuff is when it's handcuff time. And if you could kind of explain things and talk, that helps a lot. And a lot of times, either mom or grandma was there. And, why are you taking my son? Why are you taking my grandson? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, hey, just don't blow her off. If it's safe and you have the opportunity, hey, take the 2 minutes. You know what? Sonny boy here, yeah, he's got some old business. He missed a couple of court dates. He's got to go to jail. He'll be out tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. This is where you could go bail him out, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of times that, again, you're building bridges, not to be too corny about it, but it's true. Just take that
Mhm.
extra like 2 minutes if you can, and if
Yeah.
it's possible. That means a lot. It really does. So let's talk about organized crime. When I think of Canada, I don't think of organized crime. I
Yeah.
think of, like Chicago, New York, Cleveland, Buffalo, by you, I could totally see that, New Jersey, but not Canada. So, what crime syndicates were prevalent when you were policing up there in Ontario or where you were?
Well, I'll start with something that's recent, Patrick. As a former intelligence investigator, I was part of the Criminal Intelligence Service. And in 2020, the Criminal Intelligence Service of Canada, they released a public report estimating that in Canada there are presently approximately 2,000 organized criminal groups and street gangs operating up here.
Wow.
In Canada, I've been on a lot of different podcasts in the United States, and I mean, it's nothing to brag about, but, Canada's always been a hotbed for criminal activity. I don't call it organized crime. I call it transnational organized crime because
Okay.
just look at we'll just start with traditional Italian mafia. You have the five main crime families in New York, the Commission, and Montreal, dating back to at least the 1950s, has always been considered to be the sixth family of New York because
Oh, okay.
Montreal Montreal mafia has always been linked with the Bonanno crime family. The other major hotbeds in Canada are Toronto and then Hamilton. Hamilton is literally 45 minutes outside of Toronto, and Hamilton's about an hour from Buffalo, New York.
Okay.
And historically, even to this day, even though the mafia is still around, it's watered down. It's not as big and powerful as
Right.
it once was. But Hamilton, the the mafia families in Hamilton have historically been connected to Buffalo, like dating back to the Stefano Magadino days of
Okay.
the 50s, and now it's the Tadaro crime family. They've always been linked with Buffalo. And then you have, outlaw bikers and traditional organized crime are probably the two biggest groups. The Hells Angels are very prominent with chapters all across Canada. We have some of the other biker gangs, the Outlaws, Red Devils, the Back-In. They're like an East Coast a
Yeah.
motorcycle group. And in Canada, the outlaw bikers have been very tight and aligned with the traditional Italian mafia groups over the years. They work very closely
Mm.
in a number of different criminal rackets, drugs, online gaming is huge. There's a new sort of evolution of crime groups in Canada, in British Columbia. It's this amalgamation of Asian and South Asian street gangs
Interesting.
with the Hells Angels. It's called the Wolfpack Alliance. And in British Columbia on the West Coast, they've been, even when El Chapo was in power of the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico, that crime group is directly related to the Mexican cartels and the drug trade. And I've worked in some interesting joint forces operations
Yeah.
involving that. So, Mexican cartels are up here. They unfortunately, use Canada because I always say organized crime or transnational organized crime, Canada is so ripe because we have lackadaisical laws. I'm
Mm.
not afraid to say that. I'm not going to
Yeah.
sugarcoat it. Compared to the United States, a lot of your statutes and laws have a lot more teeth, especially with sentencing guidelines, compared to, our legislation.
Yeah, you
And you
don't
look
have
at
the
the
RICO
geographic
laws.
terrain.
Yeah, you don't
We
have the RICO laws like we do.
no our I think it was what was his name? He was a lawyer, G. Robert Blakey. And I talked about this in my law class. G. Robert Blakey, a lawyer, was the one that drafted the RICO statute,
Mhm.
and it wasn't fully used and implemented properly until the mid 80s when he trained the FBI. Like
Right.
this is why I developed it. Our version of that is we have a Canadian criminal code is section 467. It's the anti-gang or criminal organization. It's our version of RICO. Never been fully taken for a test drive in an Ontario court, been to the Supreme Court, but I it just doesn't carry the same weight. And my favorite example and case with RICO is how the FBI used it to really not only dismantle a lot of the crime mob families in New York, but it really propelled a lot of them to put on a government jersey and become a government witness. And
Oh, absolutely it did. Because
Big Joey,
they were looking at real time.
big time.
Yeah, there's the unwritten code of not being a rat. And it's easy to have that code when you're looking at a 5-year sentence compared to a 25 or 30-year with no chance of getting out early. It's like,
Yeah,
okay, I'm going to
yeah,
die in prison. So, or you can be a snitch, you can be a rat.
yeah. And I mean, at that, I think it was in the mid to late '90s, mid '90s, when Big Joey Messino was the boss of the Banana crime family in New York. They were throwing RICO charges at mobsters left and right.
Yep.
And one of his indictments was here's the irony was because the Bananas are connected to Montreal, was ordering the murder of a Montreal mobster in New York City. So he was a Canadian mobster. That's how tight they were. And that one indictment carried the death penalty with it at that time
Wow.
because New York State had the death penalty. And that was significant, Patrick, because at that point, Joseph Banana was a boss of one of the big five families in New York. To get a boss to flip, that was a
Oh, it's
monumental
huge.
moment.
Yeah. Yeah. So much
And
for Omerta.
Rico
Yeah.
is Rico. I mean, it's Rico.
Yeah.
We don't have that here. We don't have that.
You would
Um,
think that Canada would look at that and it's like, look at the success,
mhm,
the United States had with this. We should have our own version of this, and that would really clean out some sewers.
absolutely. We really have to. The difference is, in some big cases in the United States, when the judge says life, it's life. Um, even first degree murder here, if you're convicted of first degree murder, they say life. But after 25 years, you can start every 3 years applying for parole
Oh, okay.
eligibility.
Gotcha.
So I hate to say it, like we've seen, you know, killers do their time and they're out. So this whole notion of life, I think, is a bit misleading. It's a bit of a smoke and mirror show. There's a couple major. I won't get into it because we'll get so sidetracked.
Sure, sure.
But to come back to Rico is the real deal. Like that
Yeah,
statute is incredible, and I wish we had something that had a little bit more teeth.
sure, sure.
And it'd be nice to see crown attorneys maybe instead of dealing charges away like criminal organization charges, pursuing them. It's a lot of work involved, but
Yeah, but it's worth
that
it. I mean, there was a ton of work, but it more or less disbanded, the a big portion of organized crime in America, when it really started going, in full swing. I was thinking, it's like, you're talking about biker gangs in Canada. I don't equate biker gangs to Canada. I think it's too cold or too snowy, but hey, I'm colder up here in Wisconsin than you are where you're at in Canada. So I guess so much for that
yeah.
thought.
Well, and I'll tell you a quick. So this blows a lot of people away. Like they're very prevalent in Canada, but and there's a lot of wars going on in Canada with these different gangs. The mafia. There was a huge turf mob war in Toronto, Southern Ontario, that lasted about 10 years. Murders, fire bombings.
Hmm.
In Montreal between 94 and '02 is infamously known as the biker war years. It was between the Hells Angels and the Rock Machine. And in the biker world, it's all about control of a territory,
Sure,
and it was
absolutely.
all about that bottom rocker. Like as soon as the rock machine came in with Quebec on the bottom rocker of their leather cuts, it's war,
Yeah,
because the Hells Angels were dominant, and they're probably the most dominant biker gang in Canada, if not the world, in the OMG world,
yeah.
outlaw biker world. But that war, it took over 160 lives in 8
Wow.
years. Like it was this tit for tat.
Sure.
An HA gets murdered. They blow up, a rock machine member's house, or someone else gets whacked. And what hit the fan when an 11-year-old boy was very tragic. There was a bomb in a Jeep destined to and designed to kill a biker, but the shrapnel killed a poor innocent 11-year-old
Uh,
boy, and that's when people revolted in Montreal to the streets, like,
it,
enough's enough.
yeah, you gotta
Because
do
up until
something.
that point, there was this kind of, you
Yeah,
know,
criminals killing criminals. Yeah, it is kind of like
yeah, and the
it's
public safety factor was there, and obviously there were investigations. You need a lot of time, money, and human resource
right.
investment to investigate these groups. But when that 11-year-old boy was caught in the crossfires of that biker war, it just changed a lot of things. Especially Montreal is about 6 hours from where I'm from, but I remember um, following that
Yeah,
as a copper even at that time, because it was just so you couldn't write this stuff. So the violence has always been there. I would say that the main reasons is it's either revenge, but for the most part, the wars in the mob and the biker world, it's over territory and control of the rackets that are facilitated in those territories.
yeah, absolutely,
That's
absolutely.
it. And no different than the United States.
Yes.
Um,
That's yeah, I find that very interesting. Now, speaking of the United States, I'm sure you cross-pollinated or worked with, FBI, ATF, DEA. What did that look like? Did everybody play nice?
yeah, I didn't do probably the closest was I finished my career with the RCMP. I was seconded to the RCMP to work on their largest mafia investigation to date.
Wow.
It involved a member of the Bonanno crime family becoming a police agent in Hamilton, Ontario. So he wore a wire. He was
Okay.
paid seven figures.
Wow.
And that project, even though the RCMP were the lead, there was a major American component and connection,
Sure.
because our police agent was American. He was a street soldier in the Bonanno family, but he was very connected to the mobsters in Canada. And that again goes to show
Mm.
the cross border. The border doesn't mean anything to these guys.
Right, right.
It
Yeah.
doesn't. It doesn't at all. They are part of that life. They all are in the world of Omerta and the mafia.
Yep.
And uh, I'd probably say, aside from the conversion, $20 American, I think, is about 35 Canadian these days. So I'm sure the mobsters, for the profit margin is always better, probably, to make more American currency than Canadian. But other than that, no. But that we needed the FBI, and so that was a project we were partnered with the FBI. But I will say, when I was a supervisor in intelligence, we had FBI field offices in Toronto, NYPD members in Toronto. A lot of the intel world, and this is what I really loved, was the cross-border intel meetings. Um, Even though I'm Canadian and all these men and women that we were liaising with were American, we spoke the same language. And
Oh,
I don't mean
absolutely.
English. I mean, we're doing the exact same job,
Yeah.
and we're investigating the exact same groups. We might have different policies and procedures. We have different terminology for rank and different terminology for, RICO statute versus criminal org in our independent, um, criminal codes, or whatever it's referred to. You have Miranda rights, we have rights to counsel. But at the end of the day, once you push all those things to the side, we're doing the exact same job. So I was always, the one thing that super impressed me was, especially in the intel world, I literally could pick up the phone because I had all these contacts in my phone, drop a dime to the FBI, had an office in Toronto. You not only would get a hold of them, but they were on what you needed. And that relationship was symbiotic. So
Sure.
if they called me, I was more than happy to return the favor. And that was what really made it great was it's really about collaboration and having those contacts. So um, I've met probably many, many more men and women from the American side of law enforcement since I retired with,
Okay.
writing a book and doing podcasts, like meeting
Sure.
yourself, a lot of great people. And, you really even realize even more the commonality we have. There really is no border because
Yeah.
we all are doing the same type of work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, yeah, I had one of the things I want to talk to you about, the undercover stuff, but we're running low on time here. But do you have a situation or a story real quick about when you were undercover, something went very wrong or very right, where you're like, wow, that worked out really good? Do you have anything like that you could share?
Yeah, I'll tell you about my very first one. It was there was a major stolen auto ring operating in Toronto and chop shops and
Yeah,
whatnot. And then there was suspected organized crime tied to it, which is always the case
almost always.
typically.
Yep, absolutely.
And there was a guy selling a car on Kijiji, and I was called, and it was a perfect one to sort of cut my teeth on as a brand new undercover. And I had to create an online profile and start communicating. And eventually he was hinky. So you had to build to the phone call and then build the trust and rapport on the phone call, which led to a meet to look at the car. And he lived in a rural area. And at that time, for undercover operations, you would draft a script or an operational plan.
Sure.
And it was deemed to be low risk because there was no history of anything. But that doesn't necessarily mean
Yeah, it could still
anything
go
can happen.
sideways really fast. Yep.
Still could go sideways. So part of my training, a lot of undercovers freeze up in the moment, and your cover team, who most times do not see you because they don't want to get burned, they
Right.
might be 2 miles down the road, but they're listening to you. And this comes back to spoke. This is sort of, we're coming full circle here
Yep.
because they can't see you, they can't see the target. So they're relying on the undercover's ability to not only build a natural conversation, but if you see something, try to build it in naturally, not to arouse suspicion of the target.
Yeah. Hey,
So,
that's a very large gun on your mantle. Where did you get that? Yeah.
yeah, well, it's so ironic you say that because we're looking at the car and we're shooting the breeze for a while and I'm feeling comfortable, but you always, if you don't have that voice in your head or that little pit in your stomach, then something's wrong. But you got to channel that into being the most believable character you can be, and that's what I always strive to do. So this guy, we're looking at the car, it's running, he pops the trunk, we're talking casually, and there's a handgun sitting right there. And in that millisecond when you make contact with the gun, you don't want to stare at it, but in the back of my mind I'm like, oh boy. So I just built it in naturally, the conversation. I said, you know uh I said, holy crap, you go hunting my birds with that thing or what?
Yeah.
Because we had developed a certain rapport.
Yep.
And when we did the debriefing after, my handler, who's, kind of the supervisor responsible for your safety, he was very experienced. He said a lot of undercovers freeze up and they don't build that in. So the
Sure.
cover team doesn't know what they're seeing. But just from my training as well and some great training and instructors, I built that in casually, and the team went on high alert. Like, holy crap! This. So my whole point with this was, he shut the trunk after, and I felt relieved. But during the debrief, I made a point of we shouldn't categorize these as low, medium, or high risk
Mm.
because in policing, nothing. Even the media, even though I'm a journalist now, they always say a lot of times it was just a routine stop. Well,
No
nothing's
such thing.
routine.
There's no
And
such thing.
nothing,
Yep.
even though it might appear low risk, something could get elevated in a millisecond. And the very first day of my undercover training, We sat in a nondescript industrial building. Nothing was labeled policing. And even before the instructor spoke, they played a 12-minute body pack recording of a New Jersey undercover getting stabbed to death,
No.
locked in a drug dealer's apartment. And he wasn't stabbed to death because he was outed as a cop or wearing a wire. He just happened to be with a very violent, volatile criminal
Mm,
who decided to stab this guy and probably rob him. But, he didn't know he was an undercover.
right.
And you talk about a way to start day one, minute one in
Yeah,
undercover
that's
training.
good though.
Some
Yeah,
people, some people didn't come back the next day, Patrick, because it's not for the squeamish. You can't do this type of
sure.
job half-ass. If you're not 150% in, safety and that type of work is even more paramount. Um, so I'll never forget the sound of that. I've seen a lot of things as we all have in our police careers, but the sound of that undercover, the screams and
Uh,
oh, it's something that is unfortunately stuck in the back of my mind. But I use that as a launching pad to always remind yourself safety, 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 safety.
Absolutely. There's nothing more important. But let's switch gears here. Like I said, we're winding down, but right now you're a criminal psychology professor, you're an author. Speaking of author, you wrote the book Undercover: Stories from the Underworld of Law Enforcement. Could you give us the elevator pitch, please? What is the story about? What does it encapsulate?
It's a series of stories from men and women in Canada and the United States who have specialized in undercover work, and it gives the reader a unique front row seat to some of these stories that have never been told, and to take you on that adrenaline inducing roller coaster ride to put you in the shoes of what it would feel like or what it must feel like to be an undercover. And the one thing I say in the intro for the book is, do they do it for the extra money? And I say there is no extra money.
Yeah,
These men and women do this because they are passionate about that type of work and they want to put serious violent offenders behind jail. So there's a couple stories. Steve Murphy was awesome to be part of it with Pablo Escobar,
nice.
some amazing mafia cases and Hells Angels infiltrations in the United States, some incredible murder for hires, storefronts, some amazing men and women from the ATF, FBI, services in Canada. That really is a nice, diverse mix of criminal genres that will hopefully entice the reader.
Outstanding. All right. Again, the name of the book is Undercover: Stories from the Underworld of Law Enforcement. All right, Steve, what's in your future? Is there a book two coming out anytime soon? Or you sound like a very, very busy guy. I mean, you're teaching like I think at multiple places. You got a lot of irons in the fire.
I did release a second book last year on Amazon as well, True Crime Stories from a Canadian columnist.
Okay.
And I want to say I'm working on a really big story. I write for the Hamilton Spectator. I got to do a shout out with a colleague there. It's probably coming out in January. It's a 5-part series on a big mafia investigation in Canada that had tentacles into the United States. So
Nice.
that's look for that at the Hamilton Spectator
Very good.
online as well.
All right. Well, if people want to find out more about you and your work, where do they go?
The website for my book and a little some crime stories is www.underworldstories.com.
All right, I'll make sure I put that in the show notes. All right, Steve, you're gonna have to come back on. I think we just scratched the surface. This is a lot of fun.
I think we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was
Well,
awesome.
it was. Thank you again for being on the show, and I hope you have a good Christmas season. We're almost there.
Thanks so much, Patrick. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to you as well. And it was thank you again for having me on.